Colorado, a state of breathtaking beauty, with towering mountains, vast forests, and deep valleys carved by ancient glaciers. Every year, millions of people lace up their boots and set off into the wilderness here, searching for adventure, peace, or just a quiet escape from everyday life. But the same landscape that inspires awe can also conceal danger, because when you're deep in the mountains, far from cell service, and far from the safety of the city, anything can happen. And sometimes, it does. On a warm June afternoon, two teenage friends, bright, full of life, and with futures ahead of them, set out for what should have been a simple hike. They had walked those trails before. They knew the terrain. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous. Just a few hours in the forest, taking pictures, talking about their dreams, enjoying the summer air. But that short hike would become the last anyone ever saw of them. When they failed to return that night, families panicked. Calls went out. Search parties combed the trails. Helicopters hovered over the canopies, their lights sweeping across the valleys below. For days, their names echoed through the trees as desperate voices called out, hoping for an answer, a trace, a clue, but there was nothing. The woods, so full of life and sound, gave nothing back. No footprints, no backpacks, no signs of struggle, just silence. And as the hours turned into days, and the days into weeks, a sense of dread spread through the community. Questions hung in the air like storm clouds. Where were they? Had they run away? Had they fallen victim to the unforgiving wilderness? Or was there something darker, lurking in those mountains? As time went on, the mystery only grew colder. The teenagers' faces remained on missing posters taped to windows, pinned to bulletin boards, shared endlessly online. Their families refused to give up hope, clinging to the possibility that one day the two would walk back through the door, smiling, as if nothing had happened. But deep down, everyone knew the wilderness doesn't keep secrets forever. And then, 5 years later, it happened. Deep in the soil, not far from where they vanished, something was uncovered, a discovery so haunting, so unexpected, that it would finally reveal what became of those two young friends. This is not just the story of a hike gone wrong. It is a story of unanswered questions, of relentless searches, of families who refuse to let go, and of a mystery buried in the earth, literally waiting to be found. So join me as we step into the forests of Colorado, retrace the steps of two young friends, and uncover the chilling truth behind their disappearance. Because sometimes, the most peaceful places on earth can hide the darkest secrets. Before we can understand the mystery of what happened in those mountains, we first need to know who these two teenagers were. Emily Carter was 16 years old. She was the kind of person whose presence lit up a room. Friends described her as adventurous, curious, and always carrying her small digital camera around her neck. Photography was her passion, whether it was capturing a butterfly perched on a flower in her backyard, or the way sunlight poured through the pine trees during family camping trips. She loved documenting the beauty of the world, as if she knew that memories mattered more than anything else. Josh Miller was 17, tall, athletic, with an easy smile that made people trust him instantly. He was the kind of teenager who seemed older than his years, always looking out for others, always ready to help. Josh loved the outdoors too. He'd spent countless weekends fishing with his dad, hiking with his younger brother, or exploring new trails with Emily. Together, the two were inseparable, a friendship that had started in middle school and only grew stronger over the years. They weren't boyfriend and girlfriend, despite the whispers from classmates. Their bond was something different, something deeper. They were best friends who could spend hours together laughing about inside jokes, sharing secrets, or planning their next little adventure. And like most teenagers on the edge of adulthood, they dreamed of the future college, careers, travel. But they also lived in the moment, finding joy in the small escapes their Colorado hometown offered. On June 12, 2015, a warm Friday afternoon, Emily and Josh decided to go hiking. It wasn't unusual for them. They often explored the nearby Roosevelt National Forest, a sprawling landscape of dense woods, rocky ridges, and hidden valleys. It was the kind of place where you could feel completely cut off from the rest of the world within minutes. For Emily, it was a chance to take photos of wildflowers and sweeping vistas. For Josh, it was another opportunity to test himself on the trails. That morning, Emily tucked her camera into her bag, grabbed a water bottle, and told her mom she'd be back before dark. Josh slung on his backpack, laced up his hiking boots, and promised his dad he'd be home for dinner. There was nothing unusual about that day. No warning signs, no sense of doom. Just two friends heading out into the wilderness they loved. The trail they chose was not considered especially dangerous. It was popular with hikers, birdwatchers, and families. The route wound through tall lodgepole pines, crossed over small streams, and eventually opened up to a stunning overlook of the valley below. On that day, the skies were clear, the air was warm, and the mountains stood silent, as if watching. But the wilderness can be deceptive. Even the safest trails can become dangerous when conditions shift, when mistakes are made, or when something or someone unforeseen enters the picture. What Emily and Josh couldn't have known as they set off that afternoon was that they would never return. That simple hike, meant to last only a few hours, would become the beginning of a mystery that would torment their families and haunt their community for years. Their disappearance wasn't just about two missing teenagers, it was about everything they represented. They were children on the cusp of adulthood, bright, hopeful, and with entire futures ahead of them. Losing them wasn't just a tragedy for their families. It was a wound that cut through the entire town, a mystery that cast a shadow over the community and left parents whispering to their children, "Be careful, don't go too far, don't vanish like Emily and Josh." The story of their disappearance begins not in a dark alley or a dangerous city, but on a sunlit trail in the heart of nature, a place of beauty, a place of peace, a place that, on that summer day, would swallow two young lives whole. June 12, 2015. What began as an ordinary summer afternoon soon transformed into a date that would forever be etched into the memories of two families and an entire town. When Emily and Josh left for their hike, they were expected back within a few hours. It wasn't supposed to be an overnight trip. They carried light backpacks, water bottles, snacks, a camera, maybe a jacket. Enough for an afternoon adventure, nothing more. They didn't pack sleeping bags. They didn't bring camping gear. They weren't planning to stay in the forest once the sun went down. As the day slipped by, the first sign of trouble came quietly, almost unnoticeably. Emily's mother expected her daughter to come through the door by dinner time, cheerful, sunburned, and carrying a camera full of photos. Josh's father kept glancing out the window, waiting to see his son walk up the driveway with that familiar stride. But evening arrived, and neither teen came home. At first, the parents tried to stay calm. Teenagers lose track of time, they thought. Maybe Emily and Josh had taken a longer trail. Maybe they'd met friends along the way. But when the hours stretched past sunset and into the dark of night, worry turned into fear. The calls to their cell phones went unanswered. The familiar sound of their voices never came. And in the stillness of that night, panic began to spread. By midnight, phone calls were made. Family, friends, neighbors, they all joined together to search. Flashlights cut through the darkness as people shouted their names into the forest. "Emily! Josh!" Their voices echoed back, unanswered. When dawn broke the next morning, search and rescue teams were deployed. The sheriff's office coordinated volunteers. Dogs were brought in, trained to track scent. Helicopters took to the sky, circling above the endless green canopy of the Roosevelt National Forest. On the ground, searchers walked side by side, combing through underbrush, climbing ridges, peering into ravines. But the mountains gave nothing. No dropped water bottle, no camera, no shoe prints in the soil, no broken branches suggesting where two teenagers might have wandered off. The forest was silent, and it kept its secrets well. As the hours turned into days, the search only grew larger. Hundreds of volunteers joined in. Posters were printed and plastered across town. Emily and Josh's faces stared out from bulletin boards, cafe windows, and gas stations. News reporters descended on the town, asking questions the families couldn't answer. When did you last see them? Did they ever run away before? Is it possible they planned this? But everyone who knew them said the same thing. Emily and Josh had no reason to run, no reason to disappear. They were happy. They were grounded. They were deeply tied to their families. This was no runaway story. Something had happened in those woods, something no one could yet explain. The search stretched into its first week. Tired volunteers dragged their feet, their voices hoarse from calling the names of the missing. Police worked around the clock, chasing every possible lead. Some hikers claimed to have seen the teens near a stream that afternoon, but when investigators checked, no evidence was found. Others insisted they had spotted a strange man on the trail, but no one could identify who he was. Each lead seemed promising at first, and then collapsed into nothing. By the second week, the forest began to reclaim its normal rhythm. The helicopters stopped circling, the dogs were pulled back, volunteers returned to their lives, and the families of Emily and Josh were left with the most terrifying silence of all. Imagine the torment of a parent standing at the edge of that vast wilderness, staring into a sea of trees, knowing your child is somewhere out there, but not knowing if they are alive, injured, or already gone. That was the reality both families faced, and as the days melted into weeks, the uncertainty became almost unbearable. The case grew stranger with every passing day. Statistically, most hikers lost in the Colorado backcountry are found within the first 48 hours alive, injured, or tragically, deceased. But Emily and Josh left no trace at all. Not a shred of clothing, not a footprint, not a single clue to mark where they had gone. It was as if the mountains had swallowed them whole. And so, the disappearance of two ordinary teenagers became something else. A mystery. A puzzle that defied logic. A story that spread far beyond their small town and into national headlines. Parents warned their children not to hike alone. Locals whispered theories in hushed tones. And slowly, the terrible possibility took root that Emily and Josh had not simply gotten lost, but that someone or something had made sure they never came back. But with no evidence, no leads, and no answers, the case began to grow cold. What began as a frantic search now settled into an agonizing wait. And for the families left behind, each day without answers was a wound that refused to heal. When two young people vanish without a trace, the impact is never contained to just their families. It ripples outward, touching every corner of a community. In the case of Emily and Josh, those ripples quickly became waves that spread far beyond their small Colorado town. In the first days of the search, the community rallied with remarkable strength. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another stood shoulder to shoulder in the forests, calling out the names of children who weren't their own. Local businesses printed flyers for free. Restaurants sent food to the volunteers. Churches opened their doors for vigils and prayer. There was a sense that if everyone worked together, if enough eyes scoured the wilderness, Emily and Josh would be found. But as days turned into weeks and no answers came, something inside the community began to shift. That early hope slowly gave way to unease. Whispers started to spread. People began to speculate, to wonder, to fear. In the grocery store, shoppers spoke in hushed tones over their carts. "Did you hear they think the two might have run away?" one would murmur. No, I heard it was foul play," another would reply. In the school hallways, classmates clutched their phones, scrolling through rumors on social media, each story more dramatic than the last. On community forums online, strangers argued fiercely about what really happened, about who might be to blame, about whether the police had overlooked something obvious. And like in so many unsolved cases, suspicion soon began to circle back toward those closest to the victims. Parents were quietly scrutinized. Did they know something they weren't saying? Were there tensions at home no one had seen? Of course, investigators found no evidence of wrongdoing by the families. But in a town desperate for answers, even the innocent found themselves caught in the web of rumor. Then there were the darker theories. Some people claimed they had seen a strange man in the forest that day, someone who didn't belong, someone whose presence felt wrong. Others swore there were abandoned cabins deep in the woods, places where something sinister could happen unseen. Theories grew more and more elaborate. Was there a kidnapper operating in the mountains? Had the teens stumbled into an illegal campsite, seen something they shouldn't have, and been silenced? Or was the wilderness itself responsible? Hidden caves, sudden landslides, wild animals leaving no trace behind. The media fed the fire. News stations from Denver, then from across the nation, arrived to cover the story. Their bright cameras and urgent headlines amplified the fear. 2 teens vanish without a trace. Colorado hikers missing in mysterious circumstances. The images of Emily and Josh, smiling in their yearbook photos, appeared on television screens from coast to coast. With every broadcast, more speculation took root. For the families, this was a cruel double-edged sword. On one hand, the attention kept their children's faces in the public eye, kept pressure on investigators, and brought in tips from far and wide. But on the other, the rumors were unbearable. To wake up each morning and hear strangers on the radio suggesting wild possibilities about your child's fate, it was a torment no parent should endure. The town itself seemed to grow heavier under the weight of the mystery. Parents who once encouraged their children to play outdoors now kept them close to home. Hikes that had once been joyful escapes suddenly felt threatening. The forest that had been a sanctuary became, in people's minds, a place of danger, a place where shadows hid unspeakable secrets. And as the years dragged on without answers, the rumors only grew darker. Some claimed the case was connected to other missing hikers across Colorado, a string of disappearances stretching back decades. Others whispered that Emily and Josh had stumbled into something supernatural, that the mountains themselves had claimed them, the way ancient folklore often spoke of spirits guarding the wilderness. None of it was proven. None of it could be verified. But when human beings are faced with a void, an unanswered question, they fill it with stories. And in the case of Emily and Josh, those stories multiplied, weaving a tangled web of fear, suspicion, and unanswered questions. The official investigation tried to cut through the noise. Detectives followed leads, tested evidence, interviewed anyone who might have seen something, but every promising lead seemed to unravel into nothing. No suspects were identified. No credible sightings were ever confirmed. The rumors remained just that, rumors. Still, in the absence of truth, the community clung to those whispers, because sometimes even a frightening theory feels easier to live with than silence. At least a story, however wild, offers some explanation, some frame to make sense of the unimaginable. By the time the second anniversary of the disappearance arrived, the mystery had become a fixture of the town's identity. Emily and Josh were no longer just missing teenagers. They had become symbol of loss, of fear, of the fragile line between safety and tragedy. Their faces still hung on fading posters, their names still spoken at vigils. But the truth of what had happened to them remained buried, hidden beneath layers of rumor and unanswered questions. And as 5 years passed, with no sign, no clue, no closure, the case slipped further into the realm of legend. A story parents told their children as a warning. A shadow that lingered over the town like a cloud that refused to pass. But in 2020, everything changed. Because the mountains, patient and silent, cannot keep their secrets forever. And what lay hidden in the soil was finally about to be revealed. The disappearance of Emily and Josh began as a storm, loud, chaotic, impossible to ignore. In the early days, there were search parties, news reports, community gatherings, and endless speculation. But storms, no matter how powerful, eventually fade. And what follows is often worse: silence. For the families of Emily and Josh, That silence was unbearable. Each morning began the same way, waking up, for a fleeting second believing that maybe, just maybe, it had all been a bad dream. But reality was merciless. Their children were still gone, their rooms sat untouched, their belongings, clothes folded neatly, photographs pinned on bedroom walls, the camera Emily never came home with, Josh's baseball cap, all remained frozen in time, waiting for owners who never returned. In the first year, hope was still alive. The families poured their energy into searching. They hired private investigators, retraced trails, followed up on even the most outlandish tips. There were reports of 2 teenagers seen hitchhiking in New Mexico, another sighting at a bus station in Utah. Each time, the families rushed to check, hearts pounding, praying this would be the lead that solved everything. Each time, disappointment hit harder than the last. By the second year, the spotlight of the media began to dim. Other stories filled the news cycle. Other tragedies captured public attention. Missing posters, once taped proudly to storefronts, began to curl at the edges, weathered by rain and sun, until eventually they were taken down. The once relentless search parties dwindled. Volunteers returned to their lives, and the forest, which had echoed with the cries of searchers in those early weeks, grew silent again. For the families, though, time did not move forward. Every birthday Emily and Josh missed was like reopening a wound. At Christmas, their absence hung heavier than the ornaments on the tree. On anniversaries of their disappearance, vigils were held, candles lit, prayers whispered. Yet each year, the crowd at those vigils grew smaller. What had once united the community now seemed to remind them of a pain too great to face. Inside their homes, grief became a constant companion. Emily's mother described leaving her daughter's bedroom exactly as it was, as if one day she might walk back in and collapse on her bed after school, laughing, telling stories about her friends. Josh's father admitted he would sometimes leave the porch light on late into the night, just in case his son found his way home. These small rituals were lifelines, ways to cope with the silence that stretched endlessly around them. The third year came, the fourth. By then, hope had begun to harden into something else. Not closure, not acceptance, but resignation. A quiet acknowledgement that answers might never come. The sheriff's office, once so active in the search, now had little new to offer. The case file sat on a shelf, growing thicker with paperwork, but thinner with real leads. Detectives rotated. New officers came on the force, and with them came less urgency. The case was still open, yes, but open in name only. For the families, the world seemed divided into 2 timelines: before June 12th, 2015, and after. Life before was ordinary, filled with school events, family dinners, teenage laughter. Life after was something else entirely, a fog of grief, uncertainty, and the slow suffocation of unanswered questions. And yet, they endured, because parents do not give up on their children. Emily's mother continued to write letters to her daughter, storing them in a shoebox in her closet, as if one day Emily might return to read them. Josh's younger brother, who grew from a child into a teenager in the shadow of the mystery, wore his brother's baseball cap on difficult days, saying it made him feel like Josh was still with him. But silence can play tricks on the mind. Every time the phone rang unexpectedly, there was a rush of adrenaline. What if it was the call they had been waiting for? Every time a body was discovered somewhere in Colorado, panic returned. Was this the moment their worst fears would finally be confirmed? And every time it wasn't, relief mingled with guilt, relief that it wasn't Emily or Josh, guilt that the nightmare continued without answers. By the 5th year, the mystery had almost become folklore in the town. Children whispered about it on school buses. New families who moved into the area were told, almost like a ghost story, about the 2 teenagers who had gone hiking and never came back. The forest trails they once loved became places of unease, where people looked over their shoulders and wondered what might be lurking just beyond the trees. 5 years of silence, 5 years of birthdays missed, school graduations uncelebrated, futures unwritten. 5 years of waiting, wondering, and hurting. And then, just as the families began to believe that the silence would never break, the mountains gave up their secret. In the fall of 2020, during a construction project near the very forest where Emily and Josh had vanished, something was uncovered, something buried deep in the soil, something that would finally shatter the silence and reveal a truth more haunting than anyone had imagined. 5 long years had passed since Emily and Josh disappeared. For most people, their case had become a memory, a painful story that slowly faded into the background of the town's history. But for their families, the wound had never healed. The silence had stretched on, year after year, a constant reminder that answers might never come. And then, one ordinary morning, in the fall of 2020, that silence broke. It began with a construction crew. A new road expansion project had been approved just outside the town, cutting close to the very forest where Emily and Josh had last been seen. Heavy machinery rolled into place, tearing through soil that had remained untouched for decades. For the workers, it was just another day on the job. But for the community, what they uncovered that morning would reopen the darkest chapter in its history. One of the operators noticed something unusual in the earth, a patch of soil that looked different, disturbed. At first, he thought nothing of it. But as the machine dug deeper, something surfaced, something pale, something that should not have been there. He stopped the machine immediately. When investigators arrived, the construction site was sealed off. Yellow police tape went up, the same kind that had once fluttered through the forest during the original search. Officers carefully sifted through the dirt, and then, piece by piece, the truth emerged. Human remains. At first, no one wanted to say it out loud, but whispers spread quickly. Could it be Emily and Josh? After all these years, had they finally been found? The medical examiner was called in. Forensic teams worked late into the night, under floodlights that cast long, eerie shadows across the site. Every bone fragment, every scrap of clothing was carefully collected, logged, and bagged. And there, among the soil, they found more than just bones. They found fabric, a torn piece of denim that matched the jeans Emily had been wearing the day she vanished. They found a shoe, worn and weathered, the laces frayed from time. And they found something else, something that made the investigators pause. A bracelet, a delicate silver bracelet with a tiny star charm. Emily's mother later confirmed it was the same one she had given her daughter on her 16th birthday. The discovery left no doubt. These were Emily and Josh. For their families, the news was devastating. After years of hoping, years of praying, years of imagining every possible outcome, the truth was finally in front of them. Emily and Josh had never run away. They had never left town to start a new life. They had died there, in the shadow of the very forest they loved so much. But the discovery brought not only grief, it brought new questions. How did they end up buried there? Who had put them there? And most haunting of all, why had it taken 5 years for anyone to find them? Detectives scoured the site for clues. They examined the soil, searching for signs of how long the remains had been there. They looked for tool marks, traces of a struggle, anything that could tell the story of what happened that night. And what they found was chilling. The bodies had not simply been hidden. They had been carefully buried, deliberately. Whoever was responsible had taken the time to conceal them deep enough that searchers with dogs and equipment had missed them in those early frantic days. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional. The realization spread through the community like wildfire. For 5 years, people had whispered about Emily and Josh, that maybe they had run away, maybe they had gotten lost, maybe they had simply vanished into the wilderness. But now, those theories crumbled. Their deaths were not a mystery of chance. They were victims of something far darker. And with that discovery, fear returned to the town. Because if someone had killed Emily and Josh and buried them so carefully, that meant there was, or had been, a killer living among them. The remains were taken for analysis. DNA confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. Emily and Josh had been found. Their families finally had an answer, but not the one they had prayed for. Instead of a reunion, they were left with graves to visit. Instead of closure, they were left with deeper mysteries. What really happened that night in the forest? Who was responsible? And why had they chosen Emily and Josh? The discovery was supposed to bring answers. Instead, it only brought more questions and reopened wounds the town thought had scarred over. Because while the silence had ended, the nightmare was only just beginning. The discovery of Emily and Josh's remains reopened the case with a new urgency. No longer was this the mystery of two teenagers who had simply vanished into thin air. Now it was clear. Someone, somehow, had played a role in their deaths, and so the investigation began again. Detectives who had worked the original case returned, alongside new investigators who brought with them fresh perspectives and updated forensic techniques. The questions they faced were enormous. Who had last seen Emily and Josh alive? What had happened in the forest that afternoon? And perhaps most chilling of all, why had their bodies been so carefully hidden? As investigators combed through the evidence, several theories emerged. The first and most obvious theory was that the teenagers had encountered foul play at the hands of a stranger. The Roosevelt National Forest is vast, and though it's a place of beauty, it's also remote. People from outside the community often traveled through hikers, campers, and drifters who might leave no trace behind. Could Emily and Josh have stumbled upon someone in the forest? Someone who didn't want to be found? A stranger with dark intentions? To support this theory, detectives looked closely at the burial site. The remains were found in soil that had clearly been disturbed with tools. Whoever had placed them there had some knowledge of concealment, as the bodies had been buried deep enough to avoid detection during the original searches. That suggested planning, intent, and perhaps even experience. Could this have been the work of a transient criminal? Someone with a history of violence who just happened to cross paths with the teens? But then there was another theory, one that haunted the families even more. What if the person responsible wasn't a stranger at all, but someone from the community? The idea sent chills through the town. Because if Emily and Josh had been harmed by someone they knew, that would mean their killer had lived among them all these years, shopping in the same stores, attending the same community events, maybe even offering sympathy during the original search. Detectives revisited everyone who had been close to the teens: friends, classmates, teachers, neighbors. They re-examined old interviews, searching for inconsistencies. They looked at phone records from the day they vanished, retraced the final steps Emily and Josh had taken. Every tiny detail was scrutinized again, and soon whispers began to spread. Some believed Josh had been the target, that maybe he had witnessed something or crossed paths with the wrong person. Others thought Emily was the one in danger, perhaps because of her photography, perhaps because she had unknowingly captured something on her camera that someone didn't want exposed. But there were no photos recovered, no memory cards, no camera. If Emily had carried it that day, it was gone. Another theory focused on the possibility of an accident that had been covered up. Could Emily and Josh have met with a tragic fall, and someone afraid of blame decided to bury their remains instead of reporting it? But this explanation didn't sit well with investigators. The burial was too deliberate, too methodical. This was not panic. This was concealment. And then came the most chilling theory of all, that their deaths were the result of something calculated, that Emily and Josh had been lured, not lost, that someone had chosen them specifically. Forensic experts tried to piece together the timeline. Soil analysis suggested the bodies had been buried not long after they went missing. That meant they had likely been killed on or near the day of their hike. Autopsies were inconclusive due to the condition of the remains, but the placement of the bodies, side by side, buried together, spoke of intention. Someone had wanted them hidden, but also someone had placed them there together, almost as if in acknowledgement of their bond. The investigation grew colder the deeper it went. Leads fizzled. Suspects came and went. No physical evidence tied anyone to the crime. Yet the theories continued to swirl, fueled by both detectives and the community. Some residents claimed to have seen strange vehicles parked near the trailhead that day, an old pickup, an unfamiliar SUV, but nothing could be verified. Others remembered hearing odd sounds from the forest that evening, though memory after 5 years can be unreliable. There were even darker whispers that perhaps the case had connections beyond the town, involving people no one dared to name aloud. Rumors suggested Emily and Josh had seen something they were never meant to see. Others speculated about cult activity in the woods, tales that had long been told in hushed voices on stormy nights. Detectives, of course, had to separate fact from fiction. They combed through national databases, checking for similar cases. They compared the burial site to known patterns of offenders. They even consulted behavioral analysts who tried to construct a profile of the type of person who might commit such a crime. The profile that came back was unnerving, someone organized, methodical, able to mask themselves in plain sight. But still, no arrests were made, no charges filed. Theories grew, but answers did not. And so, the families of Emily and Josh were left in limbo, grieving not only the loss of their children, but the crushing reality that justice might never come. Theories can offer explanations. They can keep a mystery alive. But without evidence, they remain just that, theories. And so the investigation into Emily and Josh's deaths became less about finding truth and more about living with the haunting questions of what really happened in those mountains, and who was responsible for burying 2 young lives beneath the soil. The discovery of Emily and Josh's remains was not the end of the story. In some ways, it was only the beginning of another chapter, one filled with grief, frustration, and a longing for justice that never came. For their families, the years of silence had been agony. Every birthday passed without celebration. Every holiday came with an empty seat at the table. For Emily's mother, the sound of a camera shutter could still bring tears to her eyes, a painful reminder of the daughter who once carried hers everywhere. For Josh's father, every trail in the forest looked like the one his son had walked down and never returned from. When the remains were returned, the families were finally able to hold funerals. Services were crowded with mourners, classmates, teachers, and neighbors, people who had searched the woods, lit candles, and prayed for miracles. Instead, they now stood in silence, listening as 2 lives were laid to rest. The coffins were small, yet the weight they carried was unbearable. But funerals did not bring closure. Closure is a word people like to say, but for parents who bury their children, it doesn't exist. What existed instead was an ache, the constant, unshakable need to know why. The investigation, despite its renewed energy, eventually slowed. Leads dried up. Forensics could only say so much after 5 years in the earth. Detectives admitted quietly what the families feared aloud. The trail had gone cold again. Emily and Josh's killer or killers remained unknown, and so the town was left to live with the shadow of what had happened. Parents grew more protective. Children were warned not to wander far. The forest, once a place of joy and beauty, became tinged with unease. People avoided the trailhead where Emily and Josh had last been seen, as if the trees themselves remembered. Yet in tragedy, something else took root. The community began organizing annual hikes in honor of Emily and Josh, not to relive their final moments, but to reclaim the forest as a place of life, not death. Emily's photographs, preserved by her family, were displayed in the local library, images of wildflowers, sunsets, and smiling faces, reminders of the way she saw the world. Josh's younger brother started a scholarship in his name, given to students who showed the same kindness and leadership he had. Through these acts, the 2 friends were remembered not only for how they died, but for how they lived. Still, the unanswered questions remain. What happened that day on the trail? Did they encounter a stranger? Did someone they trusted betray them? Was their disappearance a tragic accident covered up, or something far more sinister, planned, and deliberate. Theories abound, but evidence is scarce. And so their story lingers, suspended between memory and mystery. For Emily and Josh's families, the years move forward, but the pain does not fade. For the town, the forest still whispers of secrets buried beneath its soil. And for all of us listening, their story is a reminder of how fragile life can be, how quickly ordinary days can turn into unsolved tragedies. 5 years of silence ended with a discovery in the dirt, but the answers everyone hoped would follow never came. And so, in a way, Emily and Josh remain where they have always been, not only in the hearts of those who loved them, but in the shadows of unanswered questions. Perhaps, one day, the truth will surface. Perhaps, one day, someone will step forward with the missing piece. Until then, their story remains unfinished, a haunting mystery of two young friends who vanished on a simple hike in Colorado and were found buried together, side by side, years later, in soil that held the secrets no one else could.